Well, hello everybody, and welcome to a conversation with Hana Assafiri, the audacity to be free. Before I introduce Hana, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land from where I'm broadcasting this evening, the Gadiba of the Eastern Maar Nation, and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And to also acknowledge their connections to land, waters, air, and community, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. This continent always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And I extend this respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be joining us today. If you would like to share where the land that you're joining us from today, please feel free to pop that in the chat box. Before I introduce Hana, I just want to go over a couple of housekeeping things. So if you're comfortable to have your cameras on, it would be great to have them on so that we can see you, and particularly when we come to the Q&A part of the conversation. But please just check that your microphone is muted so we don't get background noise. Our conversation tonight is for an hour, and there will be time for you to ask questions of Hana directly. And what we'll do is when we go to the Q&A session, I'll just get people to raise their hand icon and try and get everybody in order. If you would like to ask a question but you don't wish to be on camera, please feel free to just write something in the chat box and I will ask on your behalf. If your internet drops out for any reason, just click on the link again and you'll be brought straight back into the webinar. As you will have heard when we started, this session is being recorded and it will be made available to you within the next 24 hours. So I will send an email out tomorrow letting you know the links available. And in that email, there'll also be links to purchase Hana's book, should you wish to. And also a link to an organisation called JIRA, which is an Aboriginal women's domestic violence service that Hana supports and makes donations to. And also some of the proceeds from the sale of her book also go to JIRA too. So that information will be sent to you tomorrow. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce Hana Assafiri, who many of you will know through her extensive work in social activism, working tirelessly for women's empowerment and in the domestic and family violence sector. Those of you who are from Melbourne, like me, may have been very lucky enough to eat at the legendary Moroccan Soup Bar that Hana founded 26 years ago in North Fitzroy. It's now located in North Melbourne, and through which she has changed countless women's lives who were escaping family and domestic violence by providing employment, a wage, the means to escape, creating opportunity for change in women's issues, racism, pluralism, and intersectionality. She later expanded her mission to unify cultures through events like Speed Date a Muslim and her Conversation Salons. Hana received the Times Out Legend Award in 2015. The same year, a renowned artist Ai Weiwei included her in his collection of local social activists. In 2017, she was inducted into the Victorian Honour Roll of Women for leading social change and women's empowerment. And Hana was awarded an Order of Australia medal in 2019. Whether you already know Hana or not tonight, as tonight is your first introduction, at the end of this hour, you'll know a great deal more about her through this conversation about her memoir, Hana, the Audacity to be Free. You will learn something about her childhood living between Australia and war-torn Lebanon, an arranged marriage at the age of 15 to a violent husband, and how she escaped and reinvented herself at the tender age of 20. educating herself and using her experience to make a difference for other women. You will also see her courage, the deep respect she holds for all people across cultures, genders, belief systems, and politics, while maintaining a cheeky and irreverent, but always respectful sense of humour. Hana, in the prologue of your memoir, you write, "It's in the cracks of vulnerability that we find our strength, and through our shared stories that we push the boundaries of societal norms." So I want to thank you for tonight joining us to share some of those stories with us.
Thank you so much, Naomi, and thank you, Delphi Training Centre, and thank you all for taking time out and being part of this conversation. Equally, I'd like to echo the acknowledgement, and I sit and stand and work on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And for us, I guess this conversation, our endeavour and mine personally, is to integrate it into changing our behaviour so that we go beyond the symbolism and the rhetoric, whilst important, that we can work towards integrating this conversation and taking the responsibility that comes with our privileges of working and living and operating on these lands. Part of doing that, obviously, is as an ally to First Nations women in JIRA, donating some of the proceeds of the sales of the book, but also centering those experiences and voices, and in particular, the plight of First Nations women. If we are having a conversation about violence, the removal of children in harm's way, then First Nations women and communities do not fare well in that conversation. And there is a disconnect between what we say and what we commit to as a nation and the reality for First Nations communities. So for us, I guess, and for me personally, there's a constant endeavour to integrate and incorporate this conversation, whilst we absolutely are tussling with many causes. We simultaneously are benefactors of standing on these lands and our enduring allyship, in the hope that we can arrive at a place where we can celebrate the plurality and the dignity of every citizen in Australia. So thank you for that, and thank you, Naomi.
That's a pleasure. Okay, well, let's get the ball rolling with our first question tonight, Hana. I want to start with the why. Your memoir, and I don't know if anyone who's joining us tonight has read your memoir, but it is raw, it's very personal. And so I'm curious to know, why did you decide now was the time to tell your story? And can you tell us a little bit about the process, how it felt to write it and to share so much of yourself?
So whilst I'm very, very public, I've been for the longest time very private equally in that space. And I've been meaning to write it for the longest time, in particular, given the changing environment around us, and that we're finding more and more the erosion of some of the gains that women have made over at least the past few decades. And it seems that, you know, we're revisiting conversations like abortion laws, that we're masking and hiding behind religious freedoms, the subjugation of women. So it seems the climate around us is actually inviting us to stand firmer and not allow the erosion of some of those gains and the inroads that we've made in that conversation. So that's some of the political reasoning. And Trump, what I thought was an anomaly, all of a sudden, sadly, may be a reality. So I think those things require, in all of us, I guess, to take a stand and preserve some of the values that will hold not only women and girls, but society at large in good stead, and maintain a sense of healthier diversity. And secondly, whilst it is timely and the conversation, particularly across Australia, is being had around violence towards women and how we can do better, it's also sadly timeless, that these conversations are everyday normal for many people, and for many women in particular, whether it be coercion, subjugation, bullying, violation, that across that continuum of experience. Sadly, this is not a rarity or an infrequent event. And I wanted to be able to contribute to how we have the conversation beyond the limitations of being defined by those experiences. And so in a small way, also wanted to, what I'd wished for when I'd endured some of these experiences, a companion where I wasn't so alone. So the book and the memoir is written for those in harm's way, who find themselves in harm's way, that they have a companion to say not only are they not alone, but they don't have to endure. But also for those who want to leave, that it doesn't define who we become, and it certainly doesn't define us. And for those of us and all of us who need to step into this space and navigate, how do we begin to contribute to shifting attitudes which are giving rise to violence towards women and children, and for it to endure, that we all have a role in this conversation. So it's an invitation to all of us to reimagine and really challenge some of the etiquette and norms and traditions which enable it to endure. So there's some of the reasons why I decided to write it now, and some of the background reasons. And look, thankfully and sadly, it's been and landed in spaces where there's not an event that I've run and been part of where a number of people don't come up later and talk about the similarity in their experience. And what's been great is that it's begun to break down barriers and isolation, because violence thrives when individuals and communities are isolated. So this has been a means, hopefully continues to be, means of connecting people to the conversation.
Yeah. And I think I also want to just like acknowledge something that you said a moment ago in terms of people coming up to you after events and disclosing and sharing things with you. That, you know, also that we're mindful that there may be people joining us this evening who've had similar experiences, and you know, if that is the case, to do whatever you need to you know, to take care of yourself as we have this conversation. Okay, so I want to move on, Hana, to some of the content of the book. You were born in Melbourne in the 60s. Your mother was Lebanese and your father Moroccan, and you were raised within Middle Eastern Muslim traditions and customs. And you describe from an early age being perplexed about the differences about how your brother and men were regarded and treated compared to the role of girls and women. What was the catalyst for this big why journey for you? How did that come about?
So whilst I was born here, my mother was totally isolated, and as a result, almost became clinically depressed. So the family moved back to Lebanon, and in Lebanon, social norms and traditions and spaces for men and boys were very gendered. Men and boys occupied public spaces, from cafes to going to grocery stores, and women and girls were relegated to the home and or just the formal visitations of other kind of families. But our role was not in public spaces at all. Even simple things like getting milk and buying some of the basics. So, and not long after we were there, work was scarce, so my father left again and came back to Australia. and left my mother with 5 children in Lebanon, and then the war broke out. Now, part of that, I guess, meant that somebody had to provide for the family. And I was a middle child, obviously with my own story that was unfolding in the shadows, but at the same time needed to step outside of the women's role or the girls' roles and provide for the family, whether that was in fixing taps and door handles and electric motors, and I had to learn how to do things like that, but also going into and standing in queues and bringing back bread for us to eat, even though we didn't have much. So some of those things, I think, really early on began to highlight and show the hypocrisy of expectation. So I would then come back home, and the expectation and the clear direction for me as a girl was, you behave in ways only that are acceptable for girls and therefore women. Yet the expectation was that I go and fulfill men and boys' shoes by providing for the family. So I found that contradiction the training ground that then enabled me to begin to ask, who makes these rules? Who? Is it culture? Is it God? Whoever it is, we kind of need to have a conversation. So that was the early training ground for formulating really my defiance and questioning.
Your audacity.
My audacity.
Yeah. You speak in your memoir, Hana, about growing up being infused with the customs and traditions of women that centered around the kitchen, community, cooking, storytelling. And these things actually became the pillars of what was to become the iconic Moroccan Soup Bar. You talk about, transforming those positions or posts for women that had restrict them and confine them and turning them on their head to actually enable them for women trying to flee violence to actually be free using those kinds of skills. But before we get on to the Moroccan Soup Bar, I'm just wondering what if you can share some of your early memories in the kitchen growing up and how they did shape you.
So, as I said, kitchens were more personal, both in terms of how my mother was. And whilst we were a slightly larger family, we weren't necessarily connected to a community because we moved a lot and my father was Moroccan. So we were always on the outer, bizarrely enough. And our sense of family and sense of ourselves was had and reflected back through my mother in the kitchen, largely. Not only my mother, but also the women who at times came together to pickle and preserve and all that sort of stuff, who reinforced the same messaging. So I found the kitchen, curiously, not just a place where we cooked and prepared food for the households, but where traditions were being taught, particularly to women and girls. We were persuaded to entertain certain aspirations and dissuaded from others through and in the kitchens. And we were also, so it wasn't always negative. I mean, there were some beautiful moments and where women come together and kind of just explain to other women about, if you're pregnant and once you've had your child, you need protein, and these are some of the things you need to be able to cook in order to get protein. And they'll also offer instructions on how to control some of the dynamics in your marriage. So it was both, it was an eye-opener, and it was a training ground for women and girls, but it was also an opportunity for me to take that space and learn to subvert it so that it became a space that was more positive for women and girls, not one that contained and constrained and restricted who we became only. And you know, there were stories, and many stories, about my mother's and parents' vulnerability also witnessed in kitchens. You know, mum would at times chop an onion and she'd cry and tears would come down her face, and that was an expression of her own vulnerability and sadness. But to children, because she wanted to look after us, she would say, oh no, it was the onion that was making her cry. It wasn't really that she was sad or depressed or upset. And for the longest time, she would put an onion peel on her head. And I believed that to be true. So when she cried in kitchens, I'd peel an onion and put it on her head to stop her crying. So kitchens have been a weirdly wonderful space where not only food, but customs and traditions were created and maintained.
Mm. That's a fabulous story about the onions.
I still believe it. I still do it.
Oh, dear. I want to move on now to something more serious and personal and painful. I want to really thank you for your courage to write about the devastating experience of being sexually abused from the age of 4 for 11 years by an extended family member. And your parents' solution to your disclosure. You first of all disclosed to a teacher, and you talk about the importance of those allies, you know, in the community when kids may not have anywhere else to go. How important people like teachers or you know, the parents of friends, those kinds of allies are in helping children. But your parents' solution to your disclosure was through their cultural lens, which was a mix of how they can rescue you and also how to save the family's reputation. And so the solution to that was at the age of 15, you had an arranged marriage, and you hoped yourself that this was going to be the gateway to freedom. You talk about that, you know, a lot in your book. Instead, you found yourself trapped in a very violent marriage, and soon to become the mother of 2 young boys. You had no money of your own. You hadn't completed your high school education. And while still a teenager, you fought to get free from this violent husband and marriage, despite divorce being unheard of in your family. Now, how did you do this? How could you have dealt with all of that at such a young age and found your way out of that situation?
So look, I existed, I mean, I'd had a lot of training in adversity from a very young age. And whilst, yes, I mean, I often say that reality was my normal. I did not know any other reality. And in that found the means of escapism. I existed in my imagination a lot. I existed in observation and seeing that there was always an alternative to the nonsense that was being presented to you. And resilience for me was found in the people who did make it their business to notice and intervene. Strangers, teachers, neighbours, shopkeepers, that built my resilience as well. And so the repertoire that I'd developed as a young child, the very sources of adversity and crisis and trauma in themselves also gave me the tools to be able to exist in my imagination, exist in places where I imagined alternatives to the reality that I endured. And those alternatives were drip-fed with every experience that I had with strangers that weren't part of the environment of abuse. So And look, I mean, I don't know, the older I get and the more therapy and the more reflection, when we look back and endeavour to understand that, I think what I call intuition, what I call learned capacities, this is all been part of that journey that's been shaped by that adversity and that sense of defiance in not wanting the events to define me, that I did not want to center who I became. And this becomes a bit of a tricky conversation for me, because often when we talk about these things, we talk about them as victim survivor. And for me, I'm neither victim nor survivor. I'm somebody whose life experience has been shaped by and marred by very early on adversity, trauma, violence, absolutely. And the deliberate decision not to have those things center my life and I become a product of them, but rather imagine a world where I am not a product of those experiences. And the people I met along the way, the constant quest for learning, and all those things became greater tools to enable me to be where I am now and truly live the life that I want to and need to be living in its freedom.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, and it's when people read your book, they will see what a tremendous journey that was. And I mean, you in a moment, I want to ask you to read an excerpt from your memoir about your wedding day or your wedding night, which is it's a very confronting passage. But I want to actually, maybe I should save this question for after that difficult bit. So I'm going to save this question. So if I can ask you now, Hana, if you could read something from your book about your wedding night.
Okay. He drove us to my new home, a small one-bedroom flat. It seemed very odd that my life would begin in this way. I had no idea how to behave or what to expect. As we arrived, his mother greeted us at the door with a large bag in hand. "White sheets," she whispered. "You will need to use them later." This reminded me of the white sheets my mother had used to protect our formal furniture in Lebanon. I was flooded with an overwhelming sense of familiarity. I set them aside until they were supposedly needed. His mother gave me clear instructions for when and how to use them. She explained that she would visit us the following morning to collect them, and with those sheets, the family's honour. I found this perplexing. How could their honour be tied to the sheets? And if they were so precious, why did she leave them behind? Even now, especially now, it seems bizarre the stories people tell themselves and they expect others to believe. But there I was in my wedding dress with a relative stranger with whom I was about to begin my life. It was December, a warm, balmy evening. As we entered the flat, he loosened his tie and almost fell into the couch, as though relieved the formalities were over. I examined his face closely for what seemed like the first time. His eyes set close together, the darkest brown, a chiselled nose, and his lips almost purple. His skin was quite tanned, his form angular yet muscly. He was years older than me, which made his expression very difficult to read. I stood in front of him, not knowing what I was supposed to do. He motioned for me to sit beside him, and I did. He made small talk for about a minute. Then came the question. What would you say if I told you the sea water is sweet? I thought to myself, what an odd question. I was 15, married to a man I'd just met, sitting next to him on the day of our wedding, and then came this question. I didn't understand it, yet I knew intuitively that my answer would be life-altering. "Oh, what?" I said. "Of course it's not." He insisted, but if I tell you it's sweet. I answered, well, we can go to the beach and taste it. If it's sweet, I'll tell you it's sweet. If it's not, we will both know that it is not. Before I'd finished the sentence, I felt the back of his hand land across my face. The burning sensation of pins and needles. It reminded me of the heat and the numbness of when the dentist once pulled out my tooth. Involuntary tears ran down my face. I pulled away from him and crouched in the corner of the room.
Thank you, Hana. That is incredibly powerful. And I think, it transports us into what that must have been like for you as a 15-year-old girl, not having any idea what to expect, thinking that you were moving into to freedom from the situation that you were in since a 4-year-old, to finding yourself in more danger. I'm just wondering, like, you talk about, and this is sort of like what I was going to ask you about, which is, it's kind of like one of those funny, not funny stories around how you did actually get away in the end, or one of your attempts to get away, driving a car. Can you tell us that story?
So I could read it or I could tell it. So one day he he was upset about something. I'm pretty sure it was something about not being able to keep the child quiet or something that upset him. And obviously kitchens were the only space I existed in, the safety of being me, and I'd pickled all these beautiful jars of turnips and olives and beetroot and a whole host of beautiful things, and had them all sitting on the kitchen bench. And in his fury, he smashed them all over the kitchen floor. And I recall that the pink brine from the pickled turnips kind of ricocheted, and it painted this beautiful image all over the kitchen ceiling. And I thought, how wonderful is this art, and that it can be born out of such violent a violent expression. Anyway, so he kind of did that, and that was my experience of those moments. And he left and went to work. And this particular day, he left his car parked outside and he took a ride with his friend. So he told me that I needed to clean up, and normally I would have, but something in me that day said no. I saw the keys. I didn't know how to drive, didn't have a license. I think I was barely 16 then, but I'd observed people driving. I'd seen how, and that's my life's learning has been through observation, I've got to say. So something, I just thought, I'm out of here. I'm not staying in this situation. So, and I had a young baby who was 2 months old in a bassinet, put him on the front seat, strapped him in, and started the car, and began to drive, or began to command that the car, learned that it does what I'm asking it to do, move a little bit, and it moved, stop and it stopped, turn and it turned. And I made my way to my mother's house from, it would have been at least a 20-kilometre drive. And just having learnt intuitively the map and the directions. And I recall thinking, and I was so nervous, so nervous, and just recall thinking, my goodness, I hope, thank God I don't need to parallel park, because that would have been too difficult to do. So that's the story of one of the times that I actually left and continued to, I just think either have a conversation, we can arrive at a place of mutual respect and agreement if you have that capacity, but otherwise I cannot be controlled. I've never been a person that can just accept nonsense and the absurd.
Yeah. So eventually you do manage to escape permanently, and but that was at a huge personal price for you. In escaping, you lost custody and all contact with your boys for many years. And your book explores this pain so eloquently, and we won't go into that right now. But you describe making a decision in the face of this pain to survive, to focus on what you could control and influence. And you went back to school, you completed high school, you worked at the infamous Target, and also as a tram conductor, where you created mayhem by insisting that female tram conductors should be able to wear shorts just like the men. And then you moved into the domestic violence sector. And it was working with a survivor that the proverbial chickens came home to roost for you, and that you were confronted with the unresolved trauma of your own experiences. And our audience tonight are primarily mental health professionals working with with trauma, with abuse. I'm wondering if you can tell us something about what it was in that moment with the survivor that made you realize that there were things that were important for you to address, and something about your therapy journey, what helped, and if there were things that didn't help, to let us know what worked and what didn't work.
Yeah. So, and I guess this is probably the crux of the issues, that for the longest time, whilst, yes, I've been defiant and I thought I was okay, and having fled and left sexual abuse and then domestic violence, and then began to, I guess the seeds that I planted in my mind began to flourish and became a reality in my life, certainly slowly but surely. And then part of that work, and I had no idea, but now thinking back, I'd avoided many triggers, and I avoided them by not being in confined spaces. I avoided them by staying away from the water's edge because abuse happened around the pools. I avoided them without realizing that I was living and surviving rather than living. And on this particular occasion, I was in therapy with one of and this woman was describing some of the events and some of her abuse, and then suddenly something inside me, this panic that I'd never known before, anything similar, panic and anxiety, and I was overcome. It was visceral, it was physical, and that then, I mean, some of my co-workers knew and understood panic and triggers, and took over the session and explained to me, and that became the beginning of a journey of therapy, and a long one at that, of healing and really stepping into another dimension of healing, and moving beyond survival. But also something in that, I always knew I'd be okay, even though it was overwhelming, even though it was it was probably more difficult than enduring the experiences itself. As an adult, looking back and integrating and trying to make sense of and understanding the impact of early childhood trauma and sexual abuse in those developmental years, and then as a teenager, and then having to, I guess, reclaim myself for myself, and invest in that time and on my own healing. So in all of that, I think one of the most helpful things is a therapist who saw me and gave me back to myself by and through understanding not only the gendered lens and nature of violence and abuse, but also as it intersects with ethnicity and culture and religion and faith. That for my mother, for example, whilst any other woman could have made and would have had a whole host of other decisions at her disposal, for my mother, her only decision that she could make within an environment where she lived on the margins of society, where she lived in fear of society, that was the only decision she could make. So as a therapist who was my therapist for many years, understanding that gave me the validity and the capacity to trust her as well, and trust that she could see all of me, not just aspects of me and my experience. Because racism, as it intersects with issues of power and abuse and violence and trauma, often lands on the bodies of women and girls. And what I mean by that is oftentimes our perpetrator is also somebody who protects you. In a society where Islamophobia is rife, for example, women who seek to leave, they leave partners or perpetrators or those who violate them or control or coercively control them, but they're also opening themselves up to being unsafe in public places, because Islamophobia or racism doesn't have a go at the Quran or at a mosque or at what faith means. It expresses itself onto women and onto women's bodies. So through therapy, I guess one of the most helpful has been in understanding that profound intersectional experience as a young child, and then walking alongside me, where she became more trusted to me than one of my closest family members. And what I found unhelpful is when judgments are made, and judgments are made about my faith, my religion, my family, and the intervention, whilst well-meaning, without context, the context tells the story. And when we don't take into account the context of that experience, we can make a whole host of assumptions about my personality, who I am, my obsessive nature or lack thereof. A whole host of things are informed by understanding my context. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but
no, that it does, and thank you very much for for sharing that. I want to move on now to the Moroccan Soup Bar. It's 26 years ago. You were driving home from work. It'd been a frustrating day for for reasons that you explain in your book, and you see a sign in North Fitzroy for lease. And on an impulse and a whim, you stop, you pull over, you go to have a look at this this shop and call the real estate agent. And from there, the Moroccan Soup Bar was born. Could you ever have imagined that it would become such a Melbourne institution?
no. And look, I had no idea when, and yes, so I was working in the women's services sector, and part of that work obviously was responding to women in crisis. And this particular day, we could not find any support for a woman with 2 children. And in frustration, driving home, and for me, that was personal, that I couldn't just accept as a professional worker that, and part of what we were told is you need to have clear professional boundaries. And I understand the reasoning behind that, absolutely. And at the same time, I also personally and experientially understand what it means when a woman is left in harm's way in the street with 2 children, either to go back to violence and or to endure a night on the street, potentially unsafe. So I think our professional boundaries need to be a little more informed and perhaps adjusted to include some of these conversations. But anyway, and I was driving past, stuck in traffic, and the sign, was to my left, I recall, and something made me look at it, and I looked at it and pulled over because it was a traffic jam, and called the agent, and he was there. And all of a sudden was brokering a deal. The only thing I knew is it would be a place for women to be safe. More than that, I had no idea. And I think these are bigger conversations around intuition, what determines or defines our intuition. We are taught not to trust it, our spirit. And it's a spirit that's kept me out of harm's way. So I've had training in it, and I've developed it, and I trust it thoroughly. But it was that drove me to the Moroccan Soup Bar, to its establishment, to taking that first step and trusting in that first step, even though everybody else said, "What are you doing? This is insane. You work in women's services, you advise governments on effective responses, you sit on advisory committees. What do you know about hospitality?" And yet everything in me thought, no, the system, whilst it definitely serves a need in crisis intervention, it does not offer enduring support. It does not provide for the most vulnerable among us. And to me, it was about imagining complementary interventions and supports for women to keep women safe. Beyond that, I had no idea. It was going to be women, safety, food. And I didn't know any more than that.
We're running out of time, Hannah. I wish we had more time, but that, so I think this question is going to be the last question before we open up to people to ask questions of you. But I just wanted to sort of like say from what you said about that the intuition and the just sort of like, we'll see what's going to happen. That this is what I was talking about, alluding to at the beginning, that you took those customs and traditions and places of women that had controlled them and restricted them, and used those things as a way of setting women free. That was, absolutely just, a fabulous turnaround of those experiences. And you talk about, and I just want to sort of like mention this before the last question, is that the prevailing culture or the prevailing thoughts around women leaving violent situations is that it takes like 7+ attempts before they will be able to leave for good. But you talk about, in your book, that of all the women that came knocking on your door, looking for work, looking for support, that not one of those women returned to those violent situations. And this leads into the last question, which is that we've got a huge reckoning around violence being perpetrated by men, with at least, we know the horrifying statistics of at least one woman a week being killed by a current or an ex-partner. And that doesn't include all the women who are being seriously either physically hurt or emotionally hurt, financially controlled. This is a huge question, but how do you think, from your experience and understanding in this sector for so long, how do you think as a society can we respond to this epidemic of violence? What's right and wrong with the conversation that we're having, and how do we engage men?
So, okay, in our experience, 25 years, when I say not one woman has gone back to a violent partner, and this is over a long period of time. So it's a tried and tested organic model that developed, and it's developed around needs. It's needs driven, needs designed. Not because there's anything special about us, but because our intervention is not just about circuit breaking the crisis, which is our current national response. But we provide enduring support for women. So beyond the crisis, we recognise that women need housing, and when they have to compete with and in the private rental market, it is almost impossible. It becomes prohibitive. So the reality is they need to either go back or end up on the streets. So we speak to that in having formulated relationships with real estate agents, as well as women reimagining what a family can look like. And they end up living together and sharing childcare duties. One will look after the other one's children whilst one of them is working. There's some of the innovative ways around which we speak to the enduring needs of women so that they have real options and alternatives to returning back to violence. So this notion of band-aiding women, patching them up only to return again and again, I think is a self-fulfilling because we're not addressing not only there's no political will and proper resourcing, but there's also mixed messaging. So on the one hand, we say to men and boys, for example, oh, we absolutely do not condone violence against women and children and minorities and the vulnerable, but at the same time, we celebrate violence in every other public setting. A boxing ring, in Parliament House, the way in which they have their arguments, the abuse at one another, the brute force in sports, in armies and the celebration of wars. All these things are an extension of attitudes that we're trying to say are not okay. But so the double speak around mixed messaging, we need to clearly and unequivocally and in a way that is not negotiable signal that violence is a primitive, unsophisticated way of dealing with conflict and tension. And until we can, and our messaging, whether through schools, through governments, through media, at every level of society, our messaging has to consistently deliver that. Equally, for women and girls, when we say it's not okay in rhetoric, we say this in policy, we say this in at every level of government, and yet you can hurt, harm, bully, abuse, and coerce a woman with little or no consequence. In fact, you can be promoted if, depending on the setting that you're in. So I think consistency in what we say and how we behave, and regulating accountability and ensuring clear accountability throughout. And the last thing I would say on men and boys is we have not taken advantage of engaging men and boys in a way that as allies in this conversation where they feel invested in this conversation. At the moment, implicit in the national discourse is men and boys are wholesale to blame for violence against women and children, and women and children are wholesale victims of male violence. That is the lack of context and nuance and understanding, I think, does the conversation a disservice. Men that perpetrate violence are absolutely responsible, but men who don't are not responsible for violence against women and children. And they are allies in this conversation and need to be engaged and invested in it. And that is the opportunity that is before us at the moment.
Yes, thank you. I mean, and it just seems like a huge task, and it's hard not to fall into that sort of like, a sense of helplessness and hopelessness about, making change. But when I hear you talk, it's, it's the passion, and it is the hope, and it's the seeing the bigger picture. And I think always is about seeing the bigger picture that will help us shift things. I just want to now throw this open or open it up to everybody. See if there is anyone who would like to ask Hana a question. If you want to just sort of like switch on your camera and your microphone if you'd like to ask a question, or the alternative is to put one in the chat box.
Come on, don't be shy, people.
Oh, yes. Okay, Margaret, you've got a question.
Hi, Margaret.
You need to unmute yourself, Margaret. I wonder if I can unmute her. Oh, hang on. Let me just see if there's something in the chat box. Actually, how can I make that? Oh, here we go. Hana, you gave such a wonderful description of intersectionality in regard to family violence. Could you repeat it, please?
That was in response to a particular question you asked me, did you not? Well, I was simply saying that the experiences for women are not just gendered, that when we're talking about racism, racism isn't just a conceptual, abstract phenomenon. It lands onto women's bodies and women become the recipients of those attitudes. And I specifically, the example that I gave was around Islamophobia, which is a form of racism. And when at the height of Islamophobia, when politicians and others in the media whip up those sentiments, people don't go out and hurt and harm a Quran or the expressions of Islam. They deliberately coerce, bully, and violate women, leaving women losing autonomy almost, because the men in women's lives do this whole bravado, stay home and I'll protect you, and really taking away women's agency. And or if women want to leave, they find themselves having to endure the public violence that is through racism and Islamophobia. Because sadly, yes, it doesn't manifest onto the symbol of the faith. It manifests in a gendered way. I hope that explains it.
There's just one more question in the chat box, Hana, and then we talked about you closing with another short reading.
Yes.
And this question is, what is something practical that we can do right now to start to change things?
I think conversations like this are a practical way, and I'm somebody, there's always hope. That we draw breath, that it resonates in one conversation. I think let's not be bystanders in this conversation, that we can all, absolutely, we all have agency. When etiquette and when social norms and traditions, when they simply enable harm and the subjugation or the violation of women and girls, I think speak up and reject them. I think it is in being mischievous that societies progress, not in upholding conventions, but in challenging them. And we can all do that in the smallest of ways, around dinner tables, with our friends, even in whilst we fumble our way through. Don't look at a situation and say that's a private matter. That's between usually him and her, or that's a cultural thing, or no. If it's not okay, if you see something, say something. If it's not okay, it's not okay. And yes, it'll be uncomfortable because we're not taught to be in those spaces, and we're not made confident and comfortable. But it is in the discomfort that we will begin to change this conversation. And yes, it is a time of reckoning, and it's inviting us to, and I think when women can enter this space, and when women lead with our strength is our compassion, that we're not punching on ideas, we're not being divisive or polarizing views, but we're drawing on the threads of humanity. And we can invite men and boys to see their own freedom and liberation in the liberation of women. This is the way, I think, the hope for the future. And this is the way we can all do it every day in very small ways.
Yes, thank you. It's about the whole issue of not being a bystander is so important. So, Hana, if you could close with another reading, that would be fabulous.
Okay, this is right at the end of the book. Trust did not come easily to me. Survival instincts guarded my vulnerability. When Elise entered my life, she created an environment where I could safely explore my deepest insecurities and fears. Elise is a swimmer. Despite my repertoire of well-crafted excuses, doing leaps in the pool, not laps, she guided me into the pool and taught me to swim. In chlorinated pools and warm beaches, 1 kilometre a day became my routine, a place of rejuvenation. In swimming, I found a healing ritual, like food, nourishing, a daily necessity. As the world grappled with the challenges of the pandemic and society's lockdown, swimming pools were closed. Pools, private, public pools, rivers, lakes. I couldn't even find a puddle to swim in. I was longing for the feeling of being submerged. It was during this time we discovered open water swimming in the chilly waters of Melbourne's winter. South Melbourne Beach beckoned me. 4.8 kilometres away from our home, we were permitted to travel 5. This quickly became a cherished ritual, keeping me and a community of swimmers afloat during testing times. Open water swimming surpassed the impact of the pandemic. It now forms a delightful part of my much-loved routine. Few experiences compare to this liberating sensory experience of open water swimming. In the vast majesty, I immerse myself seamlessly, weightless in the water's embrace. The noise and worries of the world fade, replaced by the sound of my breathing, and in the quietness of the waters beneath. With each stroke, and in the quietness of the waters, of the soothing waves, feeling myself called to venture further. Each breath draws me closer. I keep swimming, I am free. 1.5 kilometres, I reach the sweet spot. I am in the sea's most serene embrace. The sea water is sweet indeed.
Oh, it's so powerful. Hana, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm really I don't want this to end. And I'm sure other people are feeling the same too, that they wish that we had more time, but we do have to come to an end. And I want to just say in closing that what we've witnessed tonight is how you, Hana, respond to ignorance and bigotry with kindness, with compassion and authenticity. And that in an increasingly divisive world where humanity and accountability are often confused with silencing people, punishing, wokeness and cancel culture, your life, Hana, is a testament to the power of love versus the love of power. At the launch of your book in May, former Justice Coate noted, "Now more than ever, we need a Moroccan Soup Bar and a Hana in every city, town and village across Australia." And I would say across the world, we have people who've joined us here tonight from New Zealand as well, and also the United States. We all need a Hana. So I couldn't agree with that, and I want to, from the bottom of my heart, Thank you for sharing your story with us this evening. And thank you all for attending too. You'll get the link to buy the book, as well as any donations that you might want to make to JARA, the Aboriginal Women's Domestic Violence Service.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Good night, everyone. Stay warm, and hope to see you again sometime soon. Bye for now.
Please reach out if you have any questions. Reach out. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.